Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Exploring Key Data and Findings from the 2020 CF Insights Annual Survey. For those of you who are returning Candid webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you here for the first time, I'm glad you're joining us today. My name is Yvonne Sims, Network Engagement Manager for Candid based in Atlanta, and I'll be supporting today's webinar behind the scenes, as well as collecting questions you ask along the way and posing them during the Q&A. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dave. But as I do that, I will introduce you to our speaker today, David Rosado. And this is good because I haven't read your bio. So David is responsible for guiding the programmatic direction and long-term vision for Candid's two formal partner networks, the Funding Information and CF Insights. Since 2008, David has brought a focus to detail and drive for results to his evolving partnership with the Community Foundation field at Candid. David recruited Community Foundation electric grant reporters, managed the organization's pipeline of Community Foundation, provided grants data, and indexed hundreds of thousands of grant and recipient records for publication across the organization's suite of data products. As Member Services Manager for CF Insights from 2015 to 2018, David helped establish Foundation Center, now Candid, as the program's new home following its acquisition from FSG, ensuring a seamless transition for a membership expecting high quality, high touch service, and clear actionable takeaways derived from peer data to improve organizational practice. As Director of CF Insights from 2019 to 2021, David took ownership of the program overall direction, executing a complete modernization of the CF Insights website and online data platform, and charting a long-term roadmap to further solidify its status as an essential service to the field by developing a 5-year strategic plan. David also holds a BS in psychology with a minor in marketing from Brooklyn College of CUNY. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, and thank you everyone who is joining us for today's webinar. So as Yvonne mentioned, my name is David Rosado. You can call me Dave, and I'm the Network Engagement Director of Network Engagement, I should say, at Candid. And I'm going to be talking to you all about the very latest findings of the annual CF Insights survey. And I'm also going to talk a bit about how to dig into some of the more detailed data that made the publication of those findings possible. Before we jump into the main content, what I'm going to do is just say a little bit about CF Insights. And through CF Insights, we ask a simple but important question. What if each community foundation could know what all community foundations collectively know? Through CF Insights, we empower community foundations to make informed organizational decisions with actionable comparative data. Some examples of what we collect and make available include growth in assets, asset mix, fundraising trends over time, changes in grant making over time as well, staffing breakdowns by functional area, operating revenue mix, operating budgets, and so much more. We also keep an eye on trends that are happening in the field and provide consulting services for individual community foundations who are looking to better understand how their own resources are being allocated so that they can put themselves in the best position possible to create maximum impact. I'm actually going to pause here very quickly and ask Yvonne to start a poll. I am assuming most of you in attendance today are with a community foundation, but maybe not everyone. So if you can tell us what role you serve at the community foundation, let us know in the poll, or if you're not with a community foundation at all.
Okay, this is interesting. It's definitely skewed to 3. So 18% finance, 18% development, donor relations, and 64% are not with the CF or another role.
All right, super interesting. Thanks, Yvonne. So happy to say a whole lot about community foundations for those who may be a little bit less familiar with the field or at least not a part of it. But what I wanted to just mention is that just based on the data that we typically publish, it's fair to say that our general audience, anyway, not our entire audience, but most of our audience mainly includes finance folks and executives who do work at community foundations. I should also mention in the United States, that's been our focus. But there are ways in which our data and benchmarking tools can absolutely be relevant for other functional areas at the community foundation, and where we can certainly touch on all of that as well. So today, move to the next slide here. We're going to talk about the results of the latest annual field survey of community foundations reflecting the field in 2020. I'm also going to discuss how you can access and leverage even more of our data to inform the work you're all doing at your own community foundations. And for even those of you who might be pretty familiar with our survey and have been a longtime participant, this demonstration of the benchmarking tools is actually going to go a little bit differently than it has in the past, because this is the first time we've conducted the survey on our recently rebuilt data and benchmarking platform that we launched last August with the 2020 survey itself. I'm also going to talk about how you can be a part of this data set in the future if you're not already, highlight other CF Insights tools, and then we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions to close us out. As Yvonne mentioned, don't hesitate to share your questions throughout the session. The chat is open, and we're going to address as many of them as we possibly can at the end. So keep those questions coming. We welcome them all. So first, a little bit of background on the annual survey itself, just to set the table. And this survey is set up to allow us to generate newly up-to-date annual financial snapshots of the community foundation field. The survey was previously known as the Columbus Survey, and that's because it was originally administered by the Columbus Foundation starting in 1988. So the name Columbus Survey makes sense. Since moving over to the then newly formed CF Insights in 2008, the survey had undergone iterative updates and expansions to help us track general field-wide growth and other trends. We also report on some of the key operating model differences and similarities among different segments of the field as well. Most of our published data segments the field by asset size, and that's what the focus today is mainly going to be. But that's, of course, not the only way to view this data. We're always here to help you better understand how community foundations that share some other set of similarities, just beyond asset size, how they operate, how they structure themselves to help inform your own organizational strategy. Virtually all of the data that I'll be sharing today is self-reported through our survey platform, which allows us to be responsive to the needs of the field as we consider the ways in which we can expand the survey and evolve it over time. This self-reported data is also almost always more up-to-date than anything you're going to be able to find through public sources of data online. This is a fairly consistent representative sample of community foundations that participate with us each year, some details about which I'll share very shortly. So what are some of the key survey findings from 2020? What I'm actually going to do here, and bear with me for just a few seconds while I make the switch over, is I'm going to move from the slide deck over to a browser window, and I'm going to go directly to annualsurvey.cfinsights.org, which has undergone a complete overhaul and redesign with the publication of this year's results. So that's where I'm sitting now, and hopefully you can see that screen, assuming we're all good. And
yes, we're all good. And I'll drop that link in the chat as well.
Perfect, thanks, Yvonne. So just switched over here again to annualsurvey.cfinsights.org. And yeah, so another word on the redesign, right? We redesigned the site to be easier for folks to navigate and for folks to be able to access the data directly. And I'll demonstrate a couple of the download features as well. It also doesn't hurt, to be quite honest, that it's more in alignment with the look and feel of the rest of our websites and with sort of the look and feel of Candid overall. But from here, you can jump to any of the header tabs that are along the top here to view different data points and the supporting narrative related to those different data points. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to jump directly to the Respondents tab, which allows us to take a look at the overall sample and how it sort of breaks down along geographic lines and size and things like that. This year, the report features data from 211 community foundations from 43 states. And it's at this point that I want to thank every single one of you who took the time to participate in the survey, particularly on a brand new platform, with an extra special thanks and shout out to the members of the Indiana Philanthropy Alliance, nearly all of whom, the members of the Alliance, I should say, nearly all of them completed the survey this year. So the first visual here, and I'm just going to demonstrate some of the functionality before we move into more of the narrative and the data itself, but just to kind of give you an idea of how to navigate some of these features. A lot of it's pretty interactive. So right now you're just looking at a color-coded map here that's split up between West, Midwest, South, and Northeast. But if you hover over any of those 4 regions, you're going to see a few data points related to those regions. So for the West, just to kind of give you an idea, about 14% of our sample came from the West. We have 30 foundations in that region that participated. But despite the fact that they're a pretty relatively small portion of the sample in terms of the number of community foundations that have participated, they hold nearly a third of the assets. And that's sort of reflected in the larger community foundations that happen to hail from California and some of the surrounding states as well. The California Community Foundation, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, the San Francisco Foundation, East Bay Community Foundation. And so these larger community foundations, right, are based in the Western region. There are, of course, larger community foundations in every region, but that's just to say that that's one sort of takeaway that you can glean from seeing that data from the West. If you want to see a sort of clean view, a data table of those different data points all at once, you can toggle back and forth between the map or the chart view or the table view. So that's just a quick way that you can see more data at once versus maybe interacting with the website itself. We also have a breakdown of the community foundations by the size of the populations that they serve. And you can see that there's a pretty diverse split, you can sort of say, right? But a pretty wide distribution of community foundations that serve very, very small communities, right, of fewer than 10,000 people, very large communities of more than 10 million people, and by and large, communities that are sized between those two numbers. And you can sort of see the breakdown of community foundations based on the size of the population that they serve. And then one more note about the sample itself is that you can see the distribution by asset size range. And this is important because most of the rest of the site is going to feature data that is organized by asset size cohort. By and large, you're not really going to see any community foundation asset size cohort underrepresented relative to the rest of the sample, but it is fair to say that there are a lot more very, very small community foundations across the country than there are very, very large community foundations across the country. So that's one thing you'll want to keep in mind, right? If we just get a larger portion of larger community foundations who take our survey year in and year out. Not to say that we have an insignificant number of these smaller community foundations, but there are hundreds and hundreds of community foundations that are under $25 million in assets and certainly under $50 million in assets. So that is a little bit about the survey sample. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to the next tab here and talk about assets, gifts, and grants, and the change rates related to all 3 of those different metrics. So it's, as we know, right, the first part of 2020 was when the COVID-19 pandemic emerged and completely upended virtually every aspect of daily life. And that also did include a major disruption to the economy at the same time. After an initial pandemic-fueled recession, the investment market would recover, significantly recover, as you all know, and results in significant asset growth for many community foundations across the field, across the country. So this here is a direct comparison between the collective asset total for all community foundations who took last year's survey, reflecting 2019, and the community foundations who took this year's survey, reflecting 2020. We did have a slightly smaller sample this year of 2020 data than we did for 2019 data, but despite that slightly smaller sample, we still have a total collective asset, or rather a collective asset total for the entire sample that is over $10 billion higher than it was a year prior. Nearly half of all community foundations who did complete the survey for both years, 2019 and 2020, saw double-digit percentage increases in assets in 2020. And you could see that in the median up here as well. So the median change in assets was just under 10%. And about 45% of our community foundations saw their assets increase by 10% or more from 2019. We also have total gifts and grants for the entire sample. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that actually when I scroll a little bit further down the page, but you can see those totals here, collective totals for the entire sample. For fundraising and grant making, those totals are above $10 billion. And for fundraising specifically, it's over $13 billion. But I'm going to say a little bit more about that and how those two figures compare with 2019 in just a moment here as we scroll down a little bit. Here's a look at a consistent sample of the largest 100 community foundations in the country by asset size over the last 10 years. You can see that there is significant, steady asset growth over this period of time from 2011 to 2020 for this group of community foundations whose collective asset total more than doubled in that period of time. So if you go back to 2011, their asset total was a little under, or a little over, I should say, $44 billion. For 2020, that same group, their asset total is more than $95.5 billion. And of the 100 largest community foundations in the country, we have about 93 or 94 of those community foundations in this sample that have reported for all 10 years. So if we included all 100 of the largest community foundations, this would almost definitely be above $100 billion. This is one of those charts where you will want to interact with it because some of these charts do sort of refresh and react and readjust their axis based on the data that's included in the visual. So as you can see here, the gifts and grants are also included in this visual, but it's not that easy to see them because of their relative totals, their totals relative to asset size. So you can actually toggle off assets, and you can see that the chart reacts to that interaction by removing assets and then resizing the y-axis, the scale of the chart, to show just gifts and grants in a way that's easier for you to track. As soon as I toggle assets off, what probably became very apparent to everybody who's viewing this is that both fundraising and grant making increased in 2020 over 2019 totals to a significant degree. This is the largest one-year increase observed for this group since we started tracking this, really. This is the largest one-year increase in both of these metrics. So for this group, grant making increased by roughly 38%, and fundraising grew by a little bit more than that, by 42%. After a year of somewhat modest declines in both of those measures, right? So if we look at grants for a second, from 2018 to 2019, there was a slight dip and then a major increase in 2020. And then the same thing happened for gifts as well, for fundraising. So a slight dip in 2020. It was the first dip in both of these metrics for several years. But then in 2020, a major increase. This is not going to be too surprising for folks in the field, right, who recognize that community foundations were among the key philanthropic actors as the pandemic emerged. And for many community foundations across the country, as there was a sort of national reckoning with race as well, there were just resources that were mobilized into the community by a large number of community foundations across the country as they mobilized their resources to support communities of great need. Given the relationships that community foundations have with local nonprofit organizations, governments, and other stakeholders, it stands to reason that donors looking to activate their philanthropic dollars would turn to their local community foundation, who are among those most in tune with local needs and most understand local needs. Before I move on here, I just want to demonstrate that this is another example where this is a helpful visual to see just how much these metrics have increased over time. But if you want to get that clear, just clean look at the raw data, you can switch over to the table view as well and see everything all at once. To look at changes in gift and grant activity a different way, we could see how many participating community foundations increase their fundraising or grant making by double digits or more, right, over 2019 levels. So let's actually start with the gifts. That's the fundraising. That's this top stack bar here. 23%, so nearly a quarter of our community foundations who took this year's survey saw moderate increases in their fundraising, which is defined by a 10% increase or more over the previous year. And an even higher number of community foundations saw a dramatic increase of 50% or more in fundraising over the previous year. It's a pretty similar story for grant making, where 40% of community foundations moderately increased their grant making totals in 2020 over 2019. That's again of more than 10% increase in their grant making over the previous year. But there were 22% of our respondents who increased their grant making by more than half, by more than 50% over the previous year. Moving forward from there, here is the first visual that compares community foundations by asset size cohort. So what we're looking at here is we're showing gifts and grants per capita, or fundraising and grant making relative to the size of the communities being served by these community foundations by asset size. This year, every single asset size cohort saw increases in these metrics over the previous year, which just means that there were more donors that donated or that made gifts to their local community foundation over the previous year, and community foundations were more active in terms of mobilizing resources back into the community over the previous year as well. So it just demonstrates again that community foundations were very active in the philanthropic response to the emerging crises of 2020. But generally, as asset size increases, gifts and grants per capita also increase. This year, I'm going to focus on gifts for just a minute. The difference was a bit less pronounced on the fundraising side, except when you're looking at the largest community foundations here. And you're going to see a bit of a clear difference on the grant making side, but still fairly consistent until you get really to the largest community foundations. And that's where you're going to see the largest jump between groups. There are a couple of factors at play here that contribute to that difference that I'm going to speak to as we move over to the next tab of the website. I'm going to jump over to the funds tab. I'm going to start with endowed versus non-endowed assets. So this is showing the differences in assets for in the community foundation portfolios that are either endowed or non-endowed or pass-through. Again, comparing community foundations of different asset size. Larger community foundations, and you can really easily track that here with the non-endowed, that percentage of non-endowed assets tends to increase as asset size increases as well. So larger community foundations tend to have higher proportions of pass-through funds, which will be reflected in their higher grant-making totals relative to their size, relative to their population size, given that these funds can be fully activated and spent and distributed to the community at any time, unlike endowed funds from which only investment income can be granted. So not as readily available to the community as the non-endowed assets. So given that community foundations have a much higher proportion of non-endowed assets, there are just going to be more funds that are readily available to move out into the community at any given time. Now, the second factor at play when looking at community foundations that are larger and sort of thinking about their ability to move those relatively higher totals back out to the community are going to be in assets that are in donor advised funds versus other fund types among larger community foundations. So for this, instead of focusing on the visual, I'm just actually going to switch over to the data. It's a little bit easier to track the differences in the proportion of assets that are in donor advised funds as asset size increases, right? So as larger community foundations specialize their services for donors and tend to be located in more populous areas with higher numbers of high net worth individuals, they will tend to focus more on growing their portfolios of donor advised funds. And so you're going to see that reflected in the higher proportion of assets, pretty clear trend here in donor advised funds as asset size increases. And speaking of donor advised funds, which I'll stay on for just a moment here, it's not going to surprise you to hear that they also grew significantly in 2020, continuing a long-term trend that has only accelerated. The sample's collective DAF asset total, or donor advised fund asset total, grew by 7% over the previous year, with fundraising and grant making each growing by more than a third, which is another reflection on how community foundations not only mobilized their own resources in 2020, but partnered with their donor advised fund holders to do the same. If we look at this one more way, we'll focus here on distribution rates. So this chart displays median distribution rates by community foundation asset size cohort. Or put another way, right, distribution rates is defined by grants divided by assets, or the proportion of assets, the percentage of assets that go out into the community in a given year. So we're going to see here also is that generally, as asset size increases, so too does the distribution rate. So you can fairly easily track that from left to right here on this chart. And it's all of a piece with the last few metrics that I discussed already, right? So with more pass-through funds, more donor advised funds in place, larger community foundations will usually maintain higher distribution rates, usually. The orange shows the distribution rate for all funds, and the pink shows the distribution rates for just donor advised funds, which tend to be higher than the other funds at community foundations. And one note I want to make about this is that it's easy enough to look at this chart and come to the conclusion that donor advised funds are far more active grant-making vehicles than other fund types. And it is no doubt true that they are very highly active philanthropic vehicles. That is very much true. But it's important also to keep this in context because these distribution rates reflect the collective activity of all donor advised funds at any individual community foundation. And it's not looking at the distribution rates of individual donor advised funds on the fund level, by individual fund. So there could be a scenario in which there could be a smaller number of very, very, very active donor advised funds that granted out a very large percentage of their assets in a given year, with some small number of donor advised fund assets that distributed a relatively small portion of their assets in that given year, if they granted anything out at all in that given year. So this is looking at a collective total and not at the fund level, which is something that that would be really the ideal way to truly examine donor advised fund activity. This is why last year we started to ask community foundations if they have a policy in place to help prevent a situation where a DAF, a donor advised fund, might sit dormant for longer than a predefined period of time without making any grants. So 69% of our respondents said that they do have a codified policy in place, an enforceable policy in place, and nearly all of them said that 5 years, that's what this chart is showing, 5 years was the absolute maximum amount of time that they would allow for a donor advised fund to sit at the foundation without making a grant before they considered it to be dormant, and the community foundation took some action to ensure that the fund would be activated. And those steps include things like simply just notifying the fund holder to activate the fund and make a grant. But they can also distribute the funds to grant recipients that align with the donor intent, or transfer the DAF to the community foundation's unrestricted fund to ensure that it gets activated via the community foundation's unrestricted grant making as well. So that is all going to depend on what the policy is, how it's set up at the community foundation, and whether or not they put something in place to help them enforce that as well, without basically exercising variance power, which is something that all community foundations, of course, have. So from here, what I'm going to do is jump over to the last tab, operations, and talk very briefly about the revenue mix. And I'm going to switch over to the table view for this one as well. On the operations tab, right, so this is revenue mix, operating budgets are on this tab, staffing related metrics are on this tab as well. But I'm going to pause here on revenue mix by asset size cohort. No matter which asset size cohort you look at, you'll see that administrative fees, that's this first column here, is going to be the main driver, the main source of operating revenue to support community foundation operations. The average community foundation in our overall sample got 72% of their operating revenues from administrative fees, with direct fundraising, that's this column, fundraising for operations, and internal operating fund distributions, that's this column here, helping to support operations as well. And there's somewhat of a sprinkling of operating revenue from other sources as well. So fundraising to support specific programs, fee-based services that a community foundation might provide for earned income, and then there's sort of a catch-all for other revenue as well, which could include event income, investment income, things like that. For smaller community foundations, more support for operations is going to come from fundraising. So you see that they have the highest percentage here, 19% fundraising for operations. And larger community foundations are going to tend to offer more fee-based services, such as consulting, philanthropic advising services, and things like that. So they have the highest percentage, although still a fairly small percentage of revenue that's coming from those fee-for-service offerings. And then the last chart that I'll mention here, the last data point that I'll mention before moving on, is expense to asset ratio. Expense to asset ratio can be used and is often used as a shorthand indicator of the leanness of how lean a community foundation's operating model is. The conventional wisdom for a traditional community foundation is that you wanted to keep your operating budget at around or below 1% of your overall asset size. The median among all community foundations is just a tick above that, right? So just above 1% at 1.1%. And you're going to see that the ratio tends to decrease as asset size increases. And that's more than anything just an economy of scale. Because we're talking about community foundations that have $500, $750 million, $2 billion, $7 billion in assets. Their budget as a percentage of their overall asset size is typically just going to skew downward. There is an understanding, of course, and you know, anybody who's in the field would absolutely point out that community foundations across the country are absolutely becoming more, or have been for a long time, becoming more deliberate about investing in things like community leadership work, special initiatives, and other sort of proactive agenda-driven efforts to help the community foundation sort of drive proactive, impact-driven work in their community. And those investments are just that. They are not expected to generate any sort of income for the community foundation. And so community foundations across the country, a large number of them, are going to be more than comfortable with an expense to asset ratio that is above 1%, above 1.2%, and even higher than that, because they understand that they are making an investment in their community leadership work, and that's something that they integrate into their long-term strategy, and they're very comfortable with that. So before we move on, I'm going to mention a couple of features of the site itself, just to help you all when you come back here and do a little bit of exploration on your own. There are going to be two download buttons here. The one on the left, and they're found at the bottom of every tab. So when you navigate to any tab on the site, you're going to see these same two links at the bottom of any of those tabs. The download button on the left is going to give you access to an Excel file that contains all of the data on this tab. So if you download this spreadsheet, it's going to contain all of this information in that Excel file for this tab. So if you want to download everything on the site, you would switch to funds and then click the download button on that tab, switch to assets, gifts, and grants, and repeat that step again. The download button on the right is an Excel spreadsheet that will give you a list of all of the community foundations that participated in the survey this year, or whose data we complemented the survey findings with, public data sources. Their names, their total assets, their fundraising total, and their grant making total in 2020. So that is the easiest way to just access, who is included in the sample. The way to access that is to download this Excel file here by clicking the link on the right side. So I'm going to switch over to the last tab and just mention one more feature here. For those of you who are familiar with the history of CF Insights and have been tuned in to the survey results year in and year out, you know that we used to put out a publication called Benchmarking Beyond Asset Size. And that showed how community foundations would rank, let's say, or sort by asset size, distribution rate, number of gift and grant transactions, and fundraising per capita. That is still available. It is not called benchmarking by asset size anymore, and it is not a separate report. It is just featured on the website as its own tab. So you can click any of these foundation names, and you could see how, for instance, the Columbus Foundation compares with the rest of the sample, where they rank, and these 4 different data points. This is all shareable, right? So if you're somebody at the Columbus Foundation and you want an easy way to share this information, you can click one of these share buttons here and share it to Twitter, share it to Facebook, share it to LinkedIn, or just share it by email. If you want to look at the full other lists, you can just click these headers here, and you can see the data points for all of these different, or rather the rankings, the sort, how the sample sorts for each of these different data points. And that same feature is available on each one of these tabs, where you can click a foundation name and see how they compare in these 4 different metrics. So what I'm going to do from here is switch back to my PowerPoint. And tell you a little bit about how CF Insights can help you. But first, what I'm going to do is pause one more time for another poll. And I'll pass things over to Yvonne to ask how familiar you all are with the CF Insights benchmarking tools, if you are at all.
How often, on average, do you use CF Insights benchmarking tools? Weekly, monthly, fewer than 5 times per year, rarely, never. Is that what we're expecting, Dave?
With the benchmarking tools, I would have expected it to be somewhere between rare and never for folks. So I'm going to be more than happy to demonstrate how the tools work and how you can use them to inform the work at your community foundation, especially given that these benchmarking tools have undergone a very similar full teardown and redesign, the same way our results page did. So
great, thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Yvonne. So I'm going to move on from here, and thanks for participating in the poll, and talk a little bit about what some of the features are on the CF Insights website that you can leverage for to inform your own work, right? So most of the data on our annual results website is presented in the aggregate, right? There are data lists that I demonstrated at the end there where you can access some of the data points on each individual community foundation, but we have designed our database, which is the same place where community foundations complete the survey itself, to make it extremely easy for you to access disaggregated individual community foundation data. As a participant in the survey, if you are not a member of CF Insights, you can pull your own foundation's data, generate longitudinal growth reports, and and different data sets and things like that to help inform reporting that you would do internally at the community foundation. But as a member of CF Insights, and we have about 100 member community foundations, you can access our peer query tool and get access to much more detailed information on every community foundation that happens to be included in our database. And on the slide are some examples of some of the metrics that you can get access to if you are not a member and if you are a member as well. So using the redesigned query tool, members can perform lookups of other community foundations by asset size, age, geography, size of population served, staff composition, and more. There is no limit to the number of peer groups you can create. There's no limit to the number of downloads you could generate. It is unlimited access to this data, and these groups will always pull in the very latest data we have. It refreshes in real time as we approve new survey responses into the database. With this tool, you can essentially build your own custom data sets and export them as an Excel file directly from the site and create your own reports. But you can also run a selection of on-demand benchmarking reports with the peer groups you built. And these are going to be visual reports that you can export also as an Excel file. So you can download all of the data that's featured in the visual, or you can just download the visual and pop it right into a PowerPoint presentation or a report that you're preparing internally. So you can do things like compare your asset size, your asset portfolio by type, composition to peers, right? Your revenue mix, staff size by function, and a lot more. So what I'm going to do one more time is I'm going to pause my screen share, switch windows here, and jump over to our live benchmarking tool. And I'm going to jump over to the benchmarking page. So I put together an example, several example peer groups that we can sort of use as a reference and as a demonstration. But I'm going to focus on this one, and what I'm going to do is actually talk a little bit about how this page is structured, because what you can do, and as you can see, is there's no limit, right, to the number of peer groups that you can create. These are all different peer groups that I've created either for partners or for the purposes of demonstrations. Colleagues of mine at Candid have also created peer groups, and we all share an account, an organization account, that is, where we can each access each other's peer groups and iterate on those peer groups as well. That same feature works on the community foundation level. So if you are with a community foundation and you have a colleague at the same community foundation, you can create your own different peer groups, and they will be shared in one sort of pool one pool, one shared pool, basically, of peer groups, where you can access each other's groups, make changes to them, make copies of them, generate downloads based on the data on the peers within them, and all of, and much more from there. But what you can do to actually build a peer group is you're going to add a characteristic, which is to say a data point, right? So it's going to be a criteria, a search criteria, basically, an operator that's based on that criteria, and a value. And those three together are going to generate an argument, generate a search that will pull in community foundations that satisfy those criteria. So for this example, I want community foundations who have participated in the 2020 survey and their foundation assets are more than $75 million and their assets are less than $125 million. But you can actually add other characteristics as well. So you can add another row, click and again, and search through or scroll through this fairly lengthy set of data points. Or, and this is a new feature in the new platform, you could do a type ahead search and just simply search for the data point you might be looking for. So you can pop that in there and say, well, we want only community foundations who have fewer than, say, 5 staff. You can also delete characteristics, and again, you can add as many characteristics as you want. But when you're done, you're going to click the show results, and pretty instantly, that was maybe less than a second, right? Where you click show results, and it's going to go ahead and show you all of the community foundations that satisfy those criteria. So this includes the Albuquerque Community Foundation, the Community Foundation Alliance in Indiana, Community Foundation for the Alleghenies, and so on. Their survey year, the total number of staff at the foundation, and total gross assets, right? Because those are the criteria that I pulled in. But what you can also do is pull in additional data points by clicking the metrics button and adding new metrics, right? So you can see every time I click that plus button that I can add other data columns, right? So I'm going to go ahead and pull in, let's say, donor advised fund assets as a percentage of the total. I'm going to pull in state. I'm going to pull in, total. Let's say total revenues. I want total revenues. So let me type in revenue, total operating revenue, and then I'll put expense to asset ratio. So let's have that in there as well. You can reorder these however you want, right? So you can put like the staff total here as the first column. You can reorder them. And we also have a set of metric sets, as we call them. These are essentially groups of columns. So if you don't want to search for multiple columns that will comprise one key performance indicator, right, like assets per capita, this is just like one example, you can click this metric set and it's going to pull in total assets, total population of the community being served, and assets per capita. So you don't have to look for those 3 columns separately, one by one. It'll throw them all in there. So I'll click that and you can see that those columns were pulled in as well. So let me remove a couple of columns to just keep it clean. And again, here instantly, all of those data points are now available for all of those community foundations, right? So they satisfy those criteria that I talked about before, the survey year and the asset size. And now all of those columns have been included. If you want to save your changes, there is a save button up here. You can save that. You can make a copy of the peer group because maybe this is a peer group you don't want to change, but you want to make a version of it that's focused on community foundations that are aspirational to your community foundation, right? Because maybe you're in this asset size cohort, but you kind of want to look at how community foundations that are, let's say, larger than $150 million, smaller than $200 million, and how those compare on these same metrics. So you can sort of use that as an aspirational group of community foundations. You can also export this as an Excel. That button is right here. And that's going to generate a very cleanly formatted Excel file that will show the exact same data that you see on the website in the same order that it's appearing on the website. And you can create charts, you can add calculations to the Excel file to track different ratios and things like that if we happen not to have it available directly on here itself. And you can work with that data offline to make internal decisions, right? But we also have a number of visual charts that compare your community foundations to the peers in that group. So here is assets by product, right? And you saw that on the slide earlier. You can export this as an Excel. You can look at year-over-year assets, right? You can look at funds per FTE. So the number of funds that staff at your community foundation, on average anyway, work with. And you can see how that compares to other community foundations. You can look at the breakdown of operating budgets by staff and non-staff, and special initiatives, I should mention as well, and supporting organizations. So you can see how those budgets break down, and revenue mix as well. And these are all just the visual charts that you can access, but much more than that is available up here. Because if you click metrics one more time, I'm just going to show you that if you click that drop down, this is every data point we have on the database that we ask on the survey. Every question we ask on the survey is all here. So you can pull in all of those data disaggregated by community foundation. So with that, I'm going to move back to my slide deck and just also mention that our CF Insights members can also request customized benchmarking dashboards that look just something like this, very similar to this, that combine several reports in an easy to digest format. It's sent over to you in a PowerPoint and a PDF file. And we also accompany these visuals with written takeaways based on the data and how you compare with your peers. And we also do try to bring in broader field context as well to help you sort of ground where your peer group compares to the rest of the community foundation field. So if you are curious to know more about how the benchmarking tools work, how you can use them at your community foundation, or want to learn more about this peer benchmarking dashboard or some of the other features we make available through CF Insights membership, you can either reach out to us by emailing cfinsights@candid.org or just go to our website, cfinsights.candid.org. So how can you contribute to the creation of our updated field snapshots, right? Like the one I walked through earlier on our website. You can do so by sharing your financial data with us at data.cfinsights.org and registering for an account for free at any time. And that's how you participate in our survey. We send out announcements every time we open the survey by newsletter, over social media, on our website. And so you can always be in the know for when we announce our latest survey. And one thing I want to mention here is that the 2020 survey, we did close a little bit later than I would have hoped to, just given how it compared to our typical survey timeline. So as a heads up for folks that are on this webinar, we are going to be announcing the 2021 survey much earlier this year than we did last year. So look for an announcement on that on our website in something like the next 6 weeks, or 2 months or so, for us to be looking for 2021 data. Becoming a member of CF Insights, as I mentioned already, you get to instant access to all of the data that we discussed today and continuous access to new data as it comes in. Your membership dues also help support our ongoing work to bring you the latest information on the field and the development of new ways to bring you that information. And then finally, in just 1 minute, I want to mention another tool because I want to give folks time to ask questions and address some of those questions. I want to talk about another tool that we make available that happens to be for free on our website. Anyone can access, you do not have to be a member. This is our community leadership assessment tool, which we've designed to help community foundations go beyond financial metrics to assess how engaged they are in over 40 different dimensions of community leadership, like policy advocacy, DEI, humility, how much of a learning culture the community foundation supports internally at the organization, and more. All of these different dimensions are plotted out on a 7-point scale from minimal to strong and provides guideposts for helping you to determine where you would plot your community foundation on the scale. So that's why there's significant context here added to some of these ratings as well to help you figure out exactly where you would place yourself on these different measures. So in this example, the tool asks you to reflect on whether your community foundation recognizes historical power imbalances along the lines of race, class, and more, and whether the foundation accounts for these factors in its work. And our second example here is around the concept of applying an asset-based perspective versus a deficit-based perspective on how you approach community issues, and whether the community foundation recognizes the types of expertise, lived experience, those experiences and diverse perspectives of your community members. So I wanted to just show these two as examples because it goes far beyond just these two items, but this is an idea of what I mean when I say that this tool goes beyond financial metrics at something of more of a qualitative measure of how you're engaging in some of these important efforts of community leadership. The tool is designed to inform practice. So it is designed for foundations to really reflect on where you would plot yourself on some of these different metrics. And you should dedicate time to discuss the results internally with your staff and with your board potentially as well. Particularly if there are going to be any major differences in how staff rate the foundation in some of the different areas, or if there are ratings that skew low for any individual items. So you can access the print version of the Community Leadership Assessment Tool from our website. On the handout, that DOI link is a direct link to the download, so you can just click that and get the PDF version directly. And you can also, as I mentioned, just get it from our website, cfinsights.candid.org. And at the field level, the results of the tool are continuously aggregated by us to provide a broader perspective on how community foundations are engaging in some of these efforts. We have something like 50 to 60 community foundations who have filled in this tool so far. And so we have an always up-to-date version of a set of average scores among the field available on our website as well. And you can share your results with us on your community foundation at candid.org/howwelead. And so that's going to help us discover or uncover key differences in how different segments of the field engage in different dimensions of community leadership once we hit that critical mass of community foundations of different asset size cohorts. So with that, I'm actually going to pass things back over to Yvonne to get us started with answering a few questions in the time we have left.
Okay. So apparently you have blown everyone's mind because I don't see any questions quite yet. But what I'll do while people are thinking, and now your face is there, so they're definitely going to have questions. While people are getting their thoughts together, I'll just let them know what's going on for Candid next in terms of our free webinar coming up. We talk a lot about DEI practices, and we know people are really interested in moving toward equitable practices. And what we don't want them to forget is kind of that cultural foundation of your organization so that they're doing things right. And so our next presenter is going to talk about how to set that foundation. And it's a free webinar, so we're really excited to have her talk to us. And okay, now I will go to questions. Let me go here. So Dave, what is the story that you're seeing from the data this year or from 2020? Is there any particular story that you're kind of seeing that you can tell us about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, not to sort of harp on some of those changes in the fundraising and grant making, but I think that was the biggest, or most not surprising really either, but it's sort of the most significant piece of data that we collected or that we uncovered in the sample. When we, and by we, I mean Candid more broadly, we were tracking the establishment of COVID response funds, right? When the pandemic started in early to mid 2020. And we published those on our website, right? On our special page that we launched, the COVID response, philanthropic response page that we launched. And the vast majority of those funds that we had listed on that page were from community foundations. And so at the time, that was more of an anecdotal indication that community foundations were really stepping up and being the first or among the sort of key philanthropic actors in the response to the pandemic when it first emerged. And I was really eager to collect this data on 2020 because it was very much expected that we were going to see some of those significant jumps in fundraising and grant making across the field. And that's something that we absolutely saw in the data. Donor advised funds, as I mentioned, with that caveat that I mentioned too, that it's reflecting the collective DAPs and not individual DAPs. Very, very active in 2020 versus the previous year. And that's just another indication that community foundations just really are a partner to local philanthropic actors. And they position themselves that way because they are very much in tune and connected with local governments and local leaders and things like that to really understand what the needs are in the community, and that really bore out in the data as well. So to me, that was the number one story in the data that I saw.
Gotcha. And John wants to know, how are you seeing that this data is used typically when you're talking to community foundations?
Yeah, absolutely. So the use cases really do run the gamut, but I will say that some of the most common uses for it are, there's sort of like the general use for it, where a community foundation is looking for some of this data to establish a sort of dashboard of how they compare with other community foundations in their asset size cohorts to help onboard new chief executives and new board members. So that's sort of the general purpose use of the data in a lot of situations. But in terms of more practical uses, they typically include things like helping a community foundation understand how they might compare with another community foundation who happens to have one or maybe two more staff in a particular function, that allows them to scale their activity in terms of fundraising or grant making and just impact work in their community. So there could be a foundation that says, for one sort of rough example, they might say like, hey, we have seven, donor relations staff, or we have 7 program staff or something like that. And this is how much we're able to achieve with these staff. But if you look at how this community foundation that is very similar to us, but otherwise has one more donor relations staff, how many more donor advised fund holders they're able to work with to a degree that they're providing, high touch services to those donors, just because they had a little bit more staff capacity to kind of spread that responsibility around. And so, it's usually used to make cases like that, using data to make the case for additional staff for a particular function, to understand how other community foundations are structured if you just happen to have a question for them. So one data point that I didn't speak of, and I know we're at time here, is that we do have on our database is types of software used for different purposes. And so a community foundation that might be interested in switching from one prominent software provider to another prominent software provider that happens to work with community foundations might want to look at others that have made that transition in the last 2-3 years or so, and might gather those names and reach out to them to ask them some questions. So, those are 2 pretty quick, rough examples, but they're used to make very practical decisions at the community foundation.
Well, thank you so much, Dave. It is always a pleasure to hear all about your amazing work and what people can gain from it. We have your information to share with everyone on the screen, and I just want to thank everyone who attended today. And of course, if you have any questions, David obviously wants you to email him, so go ahead and email him with any questions. But thanks so much for joining us, and thank you, Dave, again. And that's all for today. Hope to see you soon.
All right, thanks, Yvonne. Thanks, everybody.